Hey, Crosswalkers, it's me. I'm here, but I'm not here all at the same time. Isn't that amazing what technology can do? Lynn and I are taking a weekend off with some friends, going to hang out at the coast, and so wanted to be with you in this way. We're continuing the series Unafraid, and today we're looking at a dystopian future. That's a word that will impress your friends, am I right? A dystopian future has to do with apocalypse and what happens about the end of the world. And there are some people that are freaked out about the end of the world coming in different ways. There are some people who are coming from a more conservative Christian vantage point, maybe upbringing, where their view of the end of the world has a very biblical kind of revelation-y sound. And the way that they were taught that is that the second coming of Christ, that there's actually a very specific timeline, and that some people are going to be raptured up to heaven, and other people that maybe aren't quite in, they're going to be left behind, as well as some other folks that don't have a chance. There's going to be some time that passes. There's going to be a final battle. And finally, at the end of the day, Christ is going to win. And the new heaven, new earth is going to be our new home, and everything's going to be great. All awful people of the world will be swimming in a lake of fire, and those of us who are good enough to make the cut, who are written in the Lamb's Book of Life, we are going to be seated in heaven with God forever. So that's one way of thinking about it. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but if we don't have the theology around it, we have other reasons to fear a dystopian future, which is the opposite of a utopian future. And that's been in our news quite a lot in recent months and years. So when we think of North Korea, when we think of Kim Jong-un, we think of nuclear threat, and at least according to him, they have the capacity to reach our shores in America with a nuclear ballistic missile. That's not good for those of us who lived on the West Coast. That means we are in the crosshairs and could potentially be the recipient of such a gift. Actually, we need to talk about this because that's a real threat. And when you have highly nationalistic, ego-driven leaders all around the world, with their fingers on a trigger that could end a lot of life, that is real. And so we need to be aware of that and think about that. And that could be a very real fear for some of us. I don't know how strongly you feel about that or where you are on that in terms of your fear level, but that's legitimate. So when Hamilton gives us his book, first he reminds us, I want to remind you of this acronym for fear: false expectations appearing real. But I also want to remind you of the way Hamilton shifted the acronym. So it's not just about false expectations appearing real, but he gives us a process by which we can work through our fears. And the first one has to do with facing our fears with faith. And what that means in this context and in all the fears that we're looking at is first to have an overriding belief that that God is good, and that the world that God created is essentially good. It's moving in a good direction, that it's a positive thing, that when God looked at all of creation and said it's good, and we saw humanity and said, well, it's very good, that's still true. Even if we have a theology which looks at the fall of humanity, and which I think is a false read of Genesis 3, that doesn't mean the whole world and everything in it's bad. This is still a creation that God gave us. It's still beautiful. It's still good. The psalmists write about this stuff. So, we got to hold on to that the creation and the created creatures in it fundamentally, mostly, are good. So we have a faith going forward that God is with us, that the creation that we live in is good. Even the people in the world, for the most part, are good. And so then we need to talk about looking at our fears, examining our fears with facts, and determining whether or not we have some assumptions that have helped create greater fears. So let's talk about some of these things. First of all, on the nuclear threat, I'll get to the theological one toward the end of this talk. But the nuclear threat actually has diminished significantly over the last 30 years or so. There's been a lot of disarmament, primarily between the United States and Russia. bringing down our arsenal of nuclear weapons. We still have plenty to do plenty of damage, and so do they, but it's much less than it was before. I remember when I was a kid in high school, we were told how many times over we could blow up the entire world and wipe out everybody. That wasn't quite right. A little bit of an exaggeration there. I don't think the science was quite on that. I was doing a little bit of research for this just out of curiosity, and found out that while we can seriously damage the world and blow up a lot of people, we do not have the capacity, nor will we ever, in our lifetime anyway, have the capacity to actually blow up the earth. We can't blow up the moon, and we certainly can't blow up the earth. The sun doesn't have enough power to blow up the earth. And we don't got anywhere near the amount of nuclear power to blow up the actual planet Earth so that it's gone. So we don't have to worry about that one. And in terms of the human beings on the Earth, I remember lots of fear about a nuclear winter and all these things. Well, if you do some reading on it, the likelihood of that happening is really, really remote. Even if all hell broke loose and every leader of every nation that had nuclear arms pulled the trigger on absolutely everything they had, here's what would probably happen, most likely. Most of those nuclear arms would go toward very strategic targeted cities, large cities that have some bearing on whether or not that country will be able to fight back. So we can imagine Washington, D.C. would be a target, New York City would be a target, L.A. would be a target, probably San Francisco would be a target, Silicon Valley, San Jose would be a target. Our major cities would be targeted. San Diego, for sure, all the military stuff down there. And we would do the same in other places. But if you look at the power of our nuclear warheads now, they're actually weaker than they were 30 years ago. And I think that's on purpose. I think we wanted to be more humane with our nuclear weapons. Figure that out. But anyway, this is probably what would happen. Let's say Kim Jong-un's got a missile and he aims one at San Francisco and aims another one at San Jose, and let's say his are as strong as ours. The likelihood is that both those cities would be wiped out. But the destruction level of that impact, because San Francisco is roughly 50 miles from Napa and San Jose is 85 miles from Napa, the likelihood, and because we're north, which means winds are in our favor, the likelihood of Napa actually experiencing the brunt of that is really, really remote. So we would see it, we would certainly be aware of it, but in terms of us experiencing the direct hit of that, that's not likely. We'll probably be called on if something like that would happen to help offer support and space for recovery and all that, but that is a threat to Napa. It's not going to happen. If Napa's going to get hit, it's going to be by extremely conservative teetotaling Baptists from Topeka, Kansas, and all they've got is picket signs, and they can throw a lot of those at us, but it's not going to wipe us out. So don't really have to worry about that. So that's an example, I think, of Hamilton stuff helping us out. Also, a little bit of research I did said that the likelihood of us being able to wipe out all of humanity with our respective nuclear arsenals is also really remote. We could have wiped out more 30 years ago than we could now. And one of the research sites I read about this said that we have the capacity to wipe out 500 million people. That's a lot of people. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to wipe out 500 million people. But even if that did happen, the remaining 7 billion people on the planet would move forward. So the likelihood of all people everywhere being wiped out is highly exaggerated. It makes for a good movie. Makes for a good scare tactic to get people to, buy a $3 million, cave dwelling or something, and if something happened in Kansas City, Hamilton refers to that, but that's probably just not going to happen. So more likelihood for you and I know this, that if we're really thinking about a dystopian future, it's much more likely to happen to us because of an earthquake, maybe a fire, but more likely an earthquake. We remember 2014 in August when that happened. I remember that Sunday morning when that hit, and I'm sure you do too if you were here. I remember the fires of last October. How can we forget it? And so that kind of a calamity is much more likely to happen to us than any kind of a world-ending nuclear type of Holocaust issue. So if you're going to have anxiety about the right thing, the likely thing, and stop worrying so much about that other thing, which is really highly unlikely. So let's talk a little bit about strategies, because that's the next step. So he talks about facing our fears with faith, examining our assumptions in light of the facts, and then he talks about actions that we can take to directly attack our fears. So let's talk about some of these practical things that we can do. This may seem a little redundant, like you could hear this anywhere, but I don't think you've heard it from me. So let me just chime in with what others are saying. So we know that we live in an earthquake-prone area. We've lived through a big one, not as big or as bad as it could have been, but it was big enough. I think we're all fine with the size of this one. And the threats are still looming. We know we live on or near fault lines. Some of the fault lines we don't even know are there. Like I think this last one. I don't think we even really knew that this one was there and could do this kind of damage. And we know fires are a reality, even though for most of us who live in the valley, they weren't a threat to the actual valley itself. Well, let me ask you some questions then in terms of attacking your fears with action, because this is what that could mean. I've seen these before the earthquake and since the fire, emergency preparedness kit. Do you have an emergency preparedness kit put together? I can't see you, but can you just raise your hand in pride if you have actually put one of these things together? Give yourselves a round of applause if you've done that. And for those of you who haven't, have a link on my blog that we'll publish at 12 o'clock today with something right from FEMA that gives you a list of suggested items to put together in a kit. These are not difficult items to come by, but I'm going to tell you from experience, the earthquake scared the bejeebies out of me. Let's put it that way. That's kinder. I didn't live with a lot of anxiety or fear, but it was a massive wake-up call to me. And I took it very seriously. And so I started to look at my house differently, about what I needed to do different in my house differently, and what I needed to prepare for in the event of another or even worse strike, a worse earthquake. And so there were some basic things that I did, like I looked in my garage and saw all this storage up on shelves surrounding my garage, knowing that if the right kind of quake hit, all that stuff is coming down. And so I secured all that stuff. So it's strapped in, and the likelihood of that coming down is really remote. And I put together an emergency preparedness kit. And it's big enough that I know we're not going to need like a long time to survive on food and water without help, because of where we live, where we all live, likelihood of help getting here really quick is really strong. But I've got enough water, I've got enough food, I've got enough emergency supplies to get us through a while, and that helps me sleep at night. So if you haven't put one together, get the list from FEMA or go to my blog and click the link, or just go online and buy one because they're easy to come by, and just put it somewhere smart where you can easily get at it in case of an earthquake, and you will sleep better at night, because that's one less thing going on in your mind, like, oh, what would I do if this happened? How would I eat? What would I drink for water if they shut off the water? Or how would I cook food because I don't have gas now? All these things. That is an action you can take which will alleviate some of your fear. The other thing, and I don't want to be morbid here, but let me be morbid here. I want to talk about your estate. I know we had a guy come in years ago to talk about living trusts. These are documents you put together. They're legal documents that make sure that your estate goes where you want it in a seamless fashion that doesn't get caught up in the court system. You can spend several $100s to a few $1,000s to have a lawyer or a company do this, or you can spend just a few $100s and do it on the cheap way. and get it done. That's the way I went, and it's legal, it works, and it's not hard to do. And I want to tell you, especially since I do enough international travel to places the State Department says I shouldn't be going, like Kenya, I sleep better at night knowing that if something terrible happened to me, that my wife would very easily be able to move into a new normal with very little court interference, and it'd be smooth sailing. And if heaven forbid, Lynn and I both, met our demise, I don't know, maybe the 15-foot marble statue of Bono that we have in our living room might fall on us unexpectedly while we're watching a YouTube video, perhaps, and then take us both out. It makes me feel better knowing that our estate and everything in it would very easily transfer to my kids so that they could easily access everything right now. I know Americans in general are really slow on this, and my hunch is that most of you have not done this, and I'm telling you, this is an important thing to do. And it will be an action to attack your fears, which will lower your anxiety, because if you don't have your house in order, and you know you don't have your house in order, that's in there. And it's bugging you even if you don't admit it. When you start to think about, what if it hits the fan? What if I have a heart attack? What if I come down ill? You're not going to have the bandwidth to do this stuff. So I'm asking you as a good stewardship thing for your resources to do this stuff. Get the emergency preparedness kit, get your living trust in order, so that stuff happens and you can rest a little bit better at night. Now, let me talk about a second bigger thing. And Hamilton just touches on this, but I want to touch a little harder on this because I think this is really the heart of the matter in this whole thing. And this is where I want to bring back the theology of the second coming of Christ. Now, this is an orthodox position. If you're new to Crosswalk and you didn't come from a church background, this whole idea might be brand new to you. This whole idea of Jesus coming back, images from Revelation of him riding on a cloud, and basically everything being judged good or bad, divvied up, lakes of fire. I mean, all kinds of stuff. The beast and all this stuff, which largely comes from Revelation, a little bit of Daniel. That stuff is an orthodox position of the Christian church, that there is a second coming that is coming when everything will be wiped out. Now, personally, you don't hear me talk about that much here at Crosswalk because I think that orthodox position, while it came from a good intention and a particular perspective, I don't think it's not a perspective that I agree with. I think that there is some context that was not appreciated and still is not appreciated by much of the conservative church. When they look at these texts, I come at it from a different position, and I feel confident where I'm at. For those who still espouse the more conservative orthodox position, which is a more literalistic rendering of Revelation as a future event and not something that has already happened in whole, in total, which means that we're still looking for that moment when Jesus is going to return on a cloud and judge the living and the dead and all that stuff. So if that's where you're coming from, this is my primary concern for you. It's not that you're getting scripture wrong. I mean, I could be wrong, who knows? But my question for you is, what does that do for your orientation toward life from here on out? Because my impression, and I've grown up in the church, I've grown up in the Baptist church, which is a conservative branch of Christianity, and here's been my impression, that the people that I have known in my life that have been passionate about end time stuff, about it's going to happen any moment, they're looking at the papers, they're seeing signs from Revelation, it's going to happen like tomorrow, they're just about ready to declare the date when the world is going to end. I have never, ever seen somebody who is wrapped up into that stuff become a more loving, graceful, compassionate person. What I have seen happen is that those people become so confident in their position and even well-meaning in their approach that they declare to other people with a sense of assuredness, know-it-allness, one-upness, that they do not in any way lure people into the faith except the most fearful among us. And that's exactly what actually the church did for decades in the last century. There were films shown like A Thief in the Night, which is a phrase lifted out of apocalyptic scripture texts about that's how it's all going to happen, like a thief in the night. This whole thing's going to shake down, and a person's going to be left behind in bed while the other person is taken up to heaven. And people had the hell scared out of them so that they would run into the arms of God. And so part of that is all right, I guess. I guess you could make a case for that, but I never saw Jesus really do that. And so this gets to my bigger sweeping thing that I want to have you think about. In the face of your fears of a dystopian future or an apocalyptic reality, I want you to remember what Jesus was remembered saying from Matthew's gospel, where he has the disciples around, and this is before they experience him ascending into heaven. And he says this, it's called the Great Commission. That's the fancy title for it. And the Great Commission, he simply tells his disciples, I want you to go make disciples of me. I want you to go out into the world, and I want you to teach them about me, teach them to listen to what I have to say, obey what I had to say, bring them into my way. That's what he means by baptizing them. And he's talking about this as an international movement. So this isn't just a thing for a few people, but it's for the whole world. Jewish people and non-Jewish people alike. That was kind of a mind blower for them. Well, what does that mean for Jesus? What does that mean for us? Does that mean that we have a whatever it takes kind of mentality to get people to say yes to Jesus? I don't think so. I think we have an orientation to the world. I think we're supposed to have an orientation to the world like Jesus had toward the world. And the methodology of Jesus as he went about trying to win his own disciples to his way of seeing things was to be a person of good news. That's what evangelism means. It means to be a people of good news. When we evangelize, it means we're bringing good news to something. This is one of those words that has gotten co-opted by a sliver of the tradition, which has kind of uglified it a little bit. Just to give you a little backstory, the word evangelism comes from a Greek word which actually the Roman government used. The Caesar would say that he had the good news, that he was the bearer of good news for all people, that he came to bring peace to the land. All these things, he said, he was the center of. So when Jesus comes along and he says, I am the good news, he was taking a direct swat at Caesar himself, and the people knew that. The people knew that when they were hearing Jesus say his thing about, I am the way, the truth, and the life, that I am bringing you good news, he knew that he was setting himself up in direct contrast to the way of Rome. In essence, he was saying, well, you've heard this way over here as being good news. And what I'm telling you is, I've got good news, but it's a different kind of good news. And it's really good news. And then Jesus would follow that up with great compassion. He would follow it up with teaching, which would restore hope in people that God actually cared about them. He would heal people who beforehand didn't think they had a chance to be healed. He would offer forgiveness where all they'd heard up to that point was condemnation. And it wasn't the kind of news that Rome brought. Rome did bring some good news. Rome did bring some security to the land. Now, Israel didn't like it because their land wasn't theirs. They weren't in charge anymore. But Rome was the superpower of the day, and that meant that Israel didn't have to worry about the foes that they'd experienced in the past because there was no chance they were coming back in because Rome ruled the day. The roads got better under Rome. Probably healthcare got better under Rome. Lots of things probably did improve under Rome, even though the taxes were high and they were unbelievably severe. So there's the caveat. They did bring some good news, but with a big, big stick that they were not afraid to use on you. Whereas Jesus comes along and says, I have good news that runs a lot deeper than Rome. It's good news that comes from the very heart of God. It says that you are a person of value, that God loves you, God has dreams for you, wants to come alongside you, help heal you, restore you, give you hope, give you strength, all these things. And you rarely hear Jesus, I'm trying to think if he ever did, in a public setting. I don't recall him ever using threat to try to win a crowd. He is remembered as saying some apocalyptic things about where things are going and all that. But I think we have to understand that within the Jewish context of the first century. That's why I don't read Revelation today as I think we would have in the first century. I think times are different. We see things different. We can look at it from a different lens. That's the primary reason why I look at it differently, along with some other things, which you can come to Wednesday and find out the intricacies of that if you like. But overall, I mean, if you look at Jesus' teaching, he's a great guy. He is good news walking around. So when he's trying to give people hope, trying to win people to the way of God, he's not doing it with threat, except the threat of, hey man, you're really missing out. There's a better way. We found some healing. We found some help. And so as you orient yourself toward a future, even if we have a serious threat around us, and if that's a nuclear threat or if that is a threat of a natural disaster, what are you really about in the world? Are you going to be a person who uses fear to trigger more fear in the world, even if it's sort of toward a good end? Or are you going to be a person who chooses to live with hope and compassion like Jesus did? To give hope and be a communicator and a bearer of good news which we proclaim that we found. And that's the one I want to be. I don't have any desire to wield threat on anybody. But I do have a desire where I see the need, if I see hurting people, struggling people, to be able to come alongside and say, there's hope for you. People who are struggling with past decisions, who are riddled with this thing, like, is this the best I've got? Is the future of my life going to be directly dictated by the past mistakes I've made? Well, the good news of Jesus is no. In fact, you could start fresh. It doesn't mean that all the stuff you've done doesn't have to be dealt with or there aren't consequences, but you have a different identity in Christ. You are loved, you're forgiven, you're welcome, and you can move forward with God's strength. For people who have had just horrible things happen to them and are broken inside, there is real healing that can happen. There is real hope. Even as we face horrible, horrible news. There's hope for marriages that are struggling based on the way of God and communication and grace and love. There are depths of which this world knows nothing about. In terms of how we offer hope and healing and good news to culture at large, in terms of how we orient ourselves to the world, we've got great news for them, because the way of Jesus, even though it is countercultural, it is the way of God. It is the way of service. It is the way of compassion. So I think that the greatest way we can deal with our fears of a horrible future is not to circle the wagons. It's not to huddle down and hope for the best and hope we get through it whenever that day comes. I think the greatest thing we can do is actually get out there and love people and serve people, because that's what God is already doing. And if we want to feel close to God, like God is going to be with us through hell, well, the best way we can feel like God is going to be with us is if we're actually with God, experiencing God regularly. And that means getting out to where God already is, because God is always at work around us. God is always at work around us. And oftentimes God is at work with people who are hurting and struggling. So if we're like Jesus, if we say go be Jesus and we mean it and we own it, it means that we know what that calls us to do. And I'm wondering if that is what you are being called to do. That if you have this fear of some kind of crazy dystopian future, and you may, I don't know what kind of anxiety level you have about that. I mean, that's legit. But the question is, what are you going to do about it? And I gave you practical stuff to do, so get on that. That's not hard to do. But then in a much bigger way, in terms of your center, who you are and who you're becoming, and what you really want to see different in the world. I love what Hamilton had to say, that he doesn't want to be found cowering in a bomb shelter. if he's going to die in that kind of dystopian future, he would rather be found in the rubble serving people, fellow human beings, in their time of need. And that's where I want to be found too. I think that's where Jesus would have been found. I think that's where Jesus calls us to be. So I invite you, as we go forward from here, to rethink our orientation even toward the most bleak future we can imagine, and decide whether or not we're actually going to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Because we are good news, and that means we can live unafraid. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.